Well, hello again, sports psychos. Welcome to chapter 16, concentration, attention, focus. You can call it whatever you want. One of the most critical skills, and frankly, one of the most misunderstood skills by coaches and by athletes, in the sense that they don't really understand how to train athletes to focus. Many coaches expect that it is something that they should just know how to do, and probably one of the most common types of feedback that I've heard coaches give athletes that's very confusing is they'll just tell them to focus, and yet they don't really tell them what to focus on and how to do that. So the athlete will just get really intense and their eyes get wide and they really try to focus and bear down. They have no idea really what they're doing. They just look like they're trying to focus. So hopefully through the podcast and the chapter you can have a better sense and get educated about what it means to concentrate or get focused. The text uses the same terminology here. Attention, concentration, the same thing. And it really has to do with mental effort. And it is a deliberate mental effort to stay on some things so that you can avoid other things. There's a great definition in there in your chapter as well, I believe from William James. The ability or the attempt to keep your attention on some things so that you avoiding other things. So check out that quote as well. I think that's the simplest way to think about it. Attending to important cues that have been identified by the athlete or by the individual so that other things you don't focus on. There's a couple different components. As I mentioned, the first one is the selecting the right cues to attend to and those to disregard, to be able to maintain that focus over time and despite distractions. Situational awareness will be able to possibly change and what's happening on this particular situation and to be able to shift that when necessary. So let's take an example of pitching. Pitching is a great one because it's really easy to identify what they should be focusing on with a particular batter. And I think even one of the athletes in this particular class, and I've worked with a variety of pitchers over years, said something like from glove to glove. That's really what they should focus on. That's pretty good. Is what kind of a pitch are you throwing, what's your grip in the glove, and where are you throwing it to. That's really about all you need to focus on during the pitch. Now, situational awareness might be you still need to do that glove to glove. However, maybe there's a runner on first base or second base, or there's two runners on first and third. So there are other things that are affecting the situation. And you may need to shift from your kind of glove to plate, ball to the glove in the catcher's mitt. You may need to shift it now to what's happening over at first base, the lead that the runner is taking. Is he stealing? What are you guys doing? Are you pitching out? What's happening? So, and athletes need to be able to concentrate and maintain that attentional focus in the first inning, the second inning, the third inning, the fourth inning, the fifth inning, how many ever innings they're in there for, each pitch. But they don't need to stay in the zone. This is a common misperception of concentration for the entire game. They only need to stay in the zone for a few seconds before each pitch and maybe a second or two after to evaluate that. Unless there's somebody on base, then of course you got to keep that. But when they're in the dugout, they don't really need to be focused. As long as they have the skill to get back on when they step up to the rubber or the mound, they're fine. Just like a golfer may need to be focused on each shot and the preparation for each shot, maybe for 30 seconds or a minute leading up to that shot. But they don't really need to stay focused on the walk between each shot while they're waiting for 5 minutes for someone else to tee off. They don't really need to do that. They also need to have strong situational awareness. That is, what's the wind doing? What's my lie? Which way is this ball naturally going to spin, or which direction is it likely to go to? What's my lie like in the sand here? What's the green like? So there's a variety of situational awareness, and they need to be able to shift that when necessary from, let me assess the situation, the wind, the lie, all that stuff, decide what stroke to hit, and then back to some sort of simple swing focus. They are able to shift from external to much more internal focus. And so it's actually quite a complex skill and requires learning. In my experience working with athletes, if athletes have had good coaching and parenting, they naturally develop these skills. If they've had poor coach/parenting, then they're a mess, and they need to overhaul their whole system. And so it's kind of a crapshoot with if they had a great experience and they had good coaching that taught them what to focus on and how to manage those cues, then they're in good shape. They're actually able to stay focused. If they have not, then like I said before, they're just a total mess. There's some good information in your chapter about the association technique, dissociation techniques, and really what you need to focus on is what are they? What's the different definitions of this, and then how does it affect performance in endurance tasks? So this is really specific sub-study, if you will, of sport performance, focusing on endurance athletes. So an associative strategy is tuning into the experience of the physical activity so that you're focused on your heart rate, your breathing, what's it feeling like, and you're tuned into what is happening in your body as you go hard, as you're having an intense workout. On the other end of that continuum would be you try to stay away from that, you dissociate. So if those of you who go to the rec center and you just tune out listening to your iPod or watching TV, as I prefer to do when I'm on some piece of stationary equipment, that's a dissociation strategy. If you're monitoring your heart rate and you're checking your pulse and you're feeling your muscle tension as you're going through a tough run, now you're associating with the strategies. There's been some good research, and particularly in elite populations, associative strategies are much more effective. Now runners will use both, and I bet you've used both. Okay, but for those who are at a higher level, it's better for them to tune in to know, do they need to push harder? Are they not working hard enough? And so that's why those associative strategies are correlated with faster running performances, because they're much more aware of what's happening. Now in training, particularly with monotonous training exercises, dissociation can decrease fatigue and allow people to tolerate that for a longer period of time. So like when I go to the rec center sometimes, and that's like my least favorite form of physical activity at this point in my life. I'd much rather be outside, playing a game, running, walking, biking. But if I have to go get on the Stairmaster or an elliptical or a treadmill, then I want to watch TV or I want to dissociate. And that's going to allow me to tolerate that for longer, and it will decrease my fatigue. And it's also very useful for new exercisers, because typically the experience of physical activity is difficult. Or if you're obese, for example, it's hard. You breathe hard. Your heart rate is up. It hurts. So you want athletes or exercisers to get away from that so that they can actually get through the experience until it gets better. It takes a few weeks or months, but if they use dissociation for the most painful parts, then that can work. Now this does not apply to weightlifting or other activities in which they would increase the likelihood of getting injured if they dissociate. So if you're teaching someone a new weight training technique and the form is important, then you don't want them to dissociate and tune out in that moment. You actually want them to associate and stay on the form so that they don't injure themselves. This really applies to aerobic performance overall. Okay, now getting into some of the findings. Peak performance we read about before. You remember the flow, and you remember what that's probably what some of those characteristics are. There is basically an absorption in the present, and there's a calm with that. So it's almost like everything's in your control. If you've had those experiences, they're some of the most memorable things that have ever happened to you probably, and certainly in your role as an athlete, those are the moments you remember. They're encoded because they're actually pure existence. They're like you're at your fullest capacity. They're just wonderfully motivating, and that's really pure intrinsic motivation. And so concentration is at its highest, total absorption at a high level in those particular moments. There's been a lot of really nice research in terms of what do experts do better than novices. And you might think of, like, for example, let's take a pro tennis player versus someone who's now in a beginning tennis class here at one of our PE classes at WVU. So experts are going to make decisions faster, and they're going to be able to tune into patterns basically in a much more efficient way. So the same amount of stimuli is out there in the environment in terms of where is this next ball coming, where is the serve likely to land, what kind of spin is on the serve, what's this ball going to do, what's the position of the opponent, where are they moving, where are they leaning. All of those little subtle cues are out there for both an expert and a novice person, but the expert has been trained and learned to tune into all those patterns and those cues in a much more efficient way. So that efficiency leads to faster decisions and then better anticipation, which is really critical in a lot of reactive sports. Taking linebackers, defensive linemen, any sort of defensive type of play in soccer, football, basketball, being able to have good attentional focus and being in that moment will allow you to be much more reactive and much quicker, which then will let you steal a ball, jump on a pass, whatever it is that you might need to do. So this research really showed us that experts become much more efficient and have a natural way of seeing what's happening in that particular sport. And it's basically the patterns that are specific to that sport that occur. And these are much more important things in open sports, and particularly team sports, because there's a lot of different things that happen. Now, Nadeffer's model is a guy who really is a pioneer in the field of attentional focus. Suggests there are 4 different types of attentional focus that go across this continuum of direction to width. And it produces 4 combinations. So up here you have broad external, you have broad internal, here you have narrow external, and narrow internal. And there's some examples here that you should be familiar with your quiz in terms of what type of attention does this athlete have. So it's a great example here as a quarterback assessing at the snap broad external focus, looking at how the defense responds and what's happening with all of his receivers, who initially appears open. Now he may switch then to narrow external to make a particular pass to an individual receiver and execute that play. So that's an example of shifting from a width of broad to narrow. Okay, now internal broad would be, let's look at the game plan, let's watch film, let's think about it, and you see all the quarterbacks after they get off the field go over and look at film to analyze internally and process and put images in their mind about what they need to execute. So that's an example of a game strategy or a game plan. Here's what we're trying to do against this defense. Internal, broad strategy. Now, if you come internal to a very narrow strategy, would be exactly how you use imagery. It's specifically rehearse an upcoming execution of a particular play. So imagine a field goal kicker. Before he goes out on the field, there's a timeout. He or she's going to execute that particular play in their mind. It's a very narrow internal image focus. Now, a narrow external would be just a couple different cues external to yourself. So this is internal, inside your mind. This is external. So you might, for example, pick a spot where you're trying to putt the ball. Or you might have a target as a golfer on the horizon of where you're hitting the ball. That's a narrow external cue. So you should be familiar with all the pieces of Nadeffer's model, although you do not need to be familiar with all the information on the test of attention and interpersonal styles that's offered in your textbook, which is basically the instrument that Nadeffer developed to use with athletes. We're going to look at this idea of choking now, which is discussed in your chapter, and also a very popular term, did they choke or not? And it really describes paralysis by over-analysis. And basically, when you choke, you need some sort of outside intervention. You've lost basic control of what's become automatic before, and it's a breakdown that involves a lot of conscious thoughts when they're really not needed. And so it's typically almost like a form of panicking, where now some simple skill like a putt has become much more complicated, and you've missed a putt of 2 feet, and you missed about 2 inches, which you probably would never do in a practice situation, and now you've totally broken down the skill. And this, of course, happens sometimes in performance situations that are high pressure. So here is the model that comes out of the textbook, which is fairly useful. So here are some basic conditions. You have some sort of critical play or a situation where you're going to be evaluated and you deem that it is important. And those situations lead to both attentional and physical changes. So let's look at the physical changes first. The physical changes that occur are similar to from your anxiety chapter. They're basically produces an anxiety response that are the basic self-talk here is, oh no, I don't know if I can handle this. So you increase your breathing, your heart's racing, and you're tense. You get into an attentional state that looks like panic. You get very internally focused, very narrow, and you reduce the flexibility. It's like all or none. You either are doing it right or you're not, and it becomes very inflexible. Okay, in your approach to that. And then what happens in your performance? You totally lose your coordination. You rush through it. You're focused on other things, and you're totally fatigued. So it's just a total breakdown and a disaster. And basically every athlete will choke at some point or another in some phase of their career. So it shouldn't be overemphasized. I mean, it does happen. And as long as an athlete doesn't get into a situation where they're putting more effort on it and making it worse because they choked once or twice, I mean, so what? You look at an example like golfers. Take Phil Mickelson. I mean, early in his career, he was one of the biggest chokers you'd ever see. He'd put himself in those opportunities in major tournaments, and he would just choke. But you can look at it from the flip side. You can either think, hey, I'm a choker, I suck, or you can think, wow, I'm putting myself in the position, and I keep making that last step wrong. But probably the 9 things out of 10 before that situation, Mickelson was doing right to get in those moments in the back 9 on those tournaments, whereas a lot of other guys weren't even getting to those situations. So you have to be able to see that with a glass is half full situation and use this as learning, because really learning is error driven, and when you make these big mistakes, it's often the last step out of 10. So the 8 or 9 things before you've done well, and this last part you choked, okay, well, learn it. Use it as a learning tool. The worst thing you can do then is try to create it like, oh, I'm a choker, or I do this every time. That's not true. Okay, so you have to evaluate it, but then help the athlete from a big picture understand how does this fit into their overall learning process and getting better. A big piece of attention, and what we do as a sports psychologist, would be helping them control their self-talk. And it's really one of the biggest things that we control as an athlete, and then we can help athletes really figure out what to do. And it typically takes 2 big shapes, and one is the emotional, the expectation element of self-talk, kind of big picture, their strategy, their attitude, their expectations, and then any task-specific self-talk that will keep them in the present moment, and it kind of keeps them away from wandering on other things. So it's typically positive or negative, kind of expectation-wise, and then also instructional, which is kind of more of a neutral self-talk, that is the task elements that I want to focus on to help me keep in the present moment. So here's an example of how it works. This is another tennis example, and I think the reason that these are all tennis examples coming from the text is that Weinberg, one of the authors, is a big tennis player and has done a lot of work in that area, and also Gould has done a lot of work with the USTA and elite tennis players as well. So maybe they just have a tennis bias. I don't know. So I'll just roll with it since I played a lot of tennis in my life as well. So the athlete makes a mistake, and instead of talking about how much they suck and this was awful and I'm never going to get this right, they say, okay, hey, keep your eye on the ball. That's a very task-relevant thing. This match isn't over. Get back into it. So it has both instructional elements, and that is relevant in this case, and it has motivational elements. Hey, let's go. Get this match isn't over. So then, okay, they get their focus back, and they maintain optimism, and they're calm because they're not focusing on the failure element of it. So you can use self-talk if you keep it simple, and then you keep the rest of the thoughts out of your brain, to improve your concentration, not get down, and also stay calm during your performances. And these things need to be learned. So you can't just give athletes, here's the positive self-talk I want you to use. They need to bring it out in competition after they have rehearsed it in practice, in the off season, and they've spent time working out the kinks. So if you go back to chapter 11 and look at how you implement the PSD program, sports psych is not so good that you can just give athletes the self-talk that they should be using. They need to rehearse it and integrate it into what they're doing in a regular practice. Here's some tips. As I mentioned before, you want these things to be very specific, short, simple, things you could write on your shoe, things you could write on a piece of tape on your wrist, or on your racket, or on your duffel bag. Very simple. You don't want this to be complex motor learning cues. They should be positive. In other words, you don't want to have on your shoe say, don't screw up. You want it to say, go for it, attack, things of that nature that are simple, inspiring, that are pieces of the big picture that you've been working on. And the athlete should come up with these things. Like I have some ideas about what it should feel like, but I wouldn't have the words that they would use, that their coach would use, that their dad would have used. And particularly during competitions, you need to be repetitive with this stuff and be kind to yourself. Okay, there's time for evaluation and judgment later. You're gonna, watch tape if you're a football player ad nauseum. Worry about it later and evaluate it. In the moment, be kind, be positive, and be aggressive. With your self-talk, and work it out. Decide what phrases are going to be most motivating to you, and the wording that you can use, and then bring those words into the cues that you're going to use in competition beforehand, during, with your team, with your captain, with your teammates. Okay, so keep it simple and make it positive so that you give yourself a shot to have a self-fulfilling prophecy to be confident during that performance. Okay, well, thought stopping is probably the most common technique that sports psychologists talk about or use. It's mostly used right, and basically means you want to change negative self-talk to positive self-talk. So it has a few steps. You identify what you're saying negatively to yourself. You find some way to stop it. And I think the chapter gives an example of imagining a stop sign. And then you refocus yourself on something that's more task relevant. So typically the negative thought is critical of yourself, of your teammate, of a referee, of something awful that could happen or already happened. You then have to have some way of stopping yourself. And sometimes that technique is just cognitive, seeing a picture of a stop sign or saying stop. Sometimes it needs to be physical, so slapping your thigh, using a rubber band on your wrist, taking a deep breath, and then you substitute. Now this process can take several months to get straight and be efficient at it. So again, if I gave an athlete this technique the day before competition, it is unlikely that it would work seamlessly into their competition and work well. And it may make them worse. So this is a process that they can use. It's a great skill to have because we're never going to stop ourselves from being negative. And we're just not going to do it. So the idea that you're just going to block out negative thoughts is craziness. That doesn't work. You should figure out what patterns your self-talk has. So, for example, do you often focus on the coaches or the referees or get frustrated with teammates? You need to know what thoughts are most commonly going to come up. And then you need to find a kinder way to speak to yourself, and so that you can keep yourself positive, optimistic, motivated throughout that entire competition, and not let this stuff get in the way of the goals that you've set for yourself. There's a good example. I can tell you from in my basketball career, and I was no professional or anything, but I used to get really frustrated with the officials, and it really used to just detract from my performance and get me way over aroused and just lead to fouls and just bad play. And so this is an example from tennis, again, sticking with that theme, but you could think of it as basketball. That was a terrible call, totally gypped. The positive side is, listen, there's nothing I can do about it. If I play well, we'll win. Or it might even say something like, I just need to keep focused on what I need to do. I'll worry about that later. It's not relevant now. Let's go. So there needs to be some positive piece to that that's energizing. It really just needs to be rationalized like, that's out of my control. Nothing I can do about it. Let it go is the basic message. Hey, let it go. Let me get back to what I'm supposed to be doing. And that way you don't end up getting too fired up, getting frustrated, getting into a fight, or something else too negative. You want to be able to minimize the amount of energy you waste on things that are totally irrelevant to you performing. So, for example, in tennis, if it was a bad line call, it's already happened. Like in tennis, you can challenge it if you're a pro, but not if you're playing college tennis. You can ask for a referee or someone else to come over and start making line calls. So if you've already done that, then don't worry about it. You still have to hit the next serve. So the next serve and what you're doing right now is the most relevant thing. You got to figure out a way to process that garbage, get it out of the way, toss it out of your brain, and get back into the present moment. And that's a very, very useful skill for athletes to have. And almost every athlete that I work with, they'll have some technique that they use to do that, depending on the sport, of course. Some good stuff from Moran, Aidan Moran, a colleague over in the UK, on how to have effective concentration. One of the big things I want you to take from this material, and it's something that all athletes, yes, athletes really can do one thing at a time. In my classes, I really spend a little bit more time in my in-person classes on helping students understand this concept as well. You can certainly be focusing on multiple elements as an athlete, but you can really only have one thought, one thing at a time. So like on your computer, you might have your Facebook up, you might be working on a paper, and you might be doing email as well. Okay, they're all up there, 3 active, but really effectively you can only do one piece at a time. So you could kind of be monitoring all of them, or you could be watching TV and studying your textbook, but the more you add to that, the less effective you're going to be at one performance. Now, so don't get confused between athletes focusing on multiple cues, which they can be trained to do, and they're all relevant in that environment, and us, this idea of multitasking. If you take the simple example of text messaging while driving, okay, there are 2 tasks, right? And it's a very clear link that if you text message while you drive, you're going to kill yourself, basically. You're much more likely to be in an accident. I don't know the exact percentage, but you can look that up pretty clearly. So that's a great example of multitasking. Multitasking will kill you, and it will absolutely murder an athlete's ability to stay focused. So they need to really think about it and do it. They need to just do it and stay on that task until that task is done. So this serve, this pitch, this point, this moment, this kick right now. Not today, one game at a time. Not one game at a time. Not one day at a time. One play at a time. One task at a time. So it's really about now, this particular moment, this second, not today. And so it's a difficult concept to explain. But in order to get better at effective concentration, they need to actually train with that capacity, deliberately doing one thing at a time. So if they're in their practice is 3 hours and there's a set of drills, they need to be focused on that drill at that moment and do that well, instead of worrying about what's coming up next. And then by doing that in practice, they'll be able to translate that at concentration over into competition. Though, as I mentioned, it needs to be in the moment, and athletes will lose their concentration, and could be in the past, could be in the future. And when they lose it, all they need to do is guide it back to the present moment. So if they don't have some sort of home base or some sort of task-specific cues to focus on, then they'll just be lost after that. So they just need something to return to in the present moment. What should I be focusing on? So coaches can definitely help them with that. Sports psychologists can definitely help them with that. Teammates can, hey, get back in the moment. Sometimes teammates go, okay, don't worry about it, forget about it. Get back, we need to do this. That's an example of a good leader, a good teammate. Get away from that. So we're all going to get distracted. We will not be in the zone. We already know that from that chapter. You're only in the zone 5 or 10% of the time. So the skill is, A, recognize when you're out of touch, you're out of focus, and then B, get back to center as quickly as you can in a few seconds. Not in a few minutes. You might have already lost the match, or you might already be down. So these skills are totally learned. And if an athlete doesn't have it, they can learn it. It will take several months. And once they learn it, they will notice an amazing difference in their ability to focus. And you would as well as a student, particularly if you struggle with concentration. You have to get rid of the distractions in your environment. Turn your phone off while you're studying. If you're reading from a textbook, don't do it in front of the TV. Don't do it in front of the computer. It will take you much longer. So if you want to practice at getting better and being more focused, you need to single task. One thing at a time, do it well for as long as you can do it, and then do the next thing. Or take a break. Okay, because otherwise, if you're, and I see a lot of younger athletes now, high school and college athletes, really struggle to be focused. And part of the reason is they spend a lot of their time outside of practice totally unfocused and multitasking. So they'll be at dinner and talking on their phone. They're not just eating. And you think it's kind of a dumb example, but it's a perfect example. When it's time to eat, my kids don't watch TV, for example. No TV during dinner time. We just eat. Okay, I don't want them doing mindless eating. If they're going to watch TV, that's fine. Just watch TV. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, but to try to do two at the same time, no good. One thing at a time will help you improve your concentration for sure. A couple other tips along the way to wrap up the podcast is, depending on your sport, you do need to learn how to shift. And I used a couple examples of golfers, tennis players, other athletes. You need to learn how to shift from different places at specific moments. And that is really through training. Parking thoughts is a really good idea in the sense that you may have identified something that you did wrong or technique-wise, but right now it's really not relevant. You need to park that until later when it's more relevant. You can address that in your training. Because in a competition, it's not relevant to judge. Okay, now maybe in a halftime you've got time to make some adjustments, spend a few minutes on that. Okay, what do we need to do differently? Okay, and then you get back to what you're doing. So you can park it until halftime, till a timeout, till after the game, and that will help you just avoid trying to block out that thought. You just park it till later. It's there. Okay, you're going to rehearse it. I mentioned that. One thing that's not done commonly is to practice being distracted. Football, coaches do this really great. Like they'll pump high volume music or noise into a practice situation so that all the offensive line and the defensive line and the quarterback can practice trying to use cues and codes and hand signals to deal with that. That's a great example of how you're ready to do that into a game because it looks just like that in a game, pretty close. And that'll also help them learn to maintain focus. I can remember hearing stories about Tiger Woods as a kid. His dad would shake his keys and yell at him while he was trying to hit putts. And you might think, well, everyone's quiet in golf. Well, no, not always, really. All that did was teach him was, let me learn to putt under duress or under some type of stress. And those little simple skills, the earlier we can teach athletes, will help them cope with bigger forms of pressure later on down the line. And hopefully then that helps them learn to maintain focus over time. So if you can only maintain focus for 30 seconds, then do it for 30 seconds. Eventually you'll be able to do it for a minute. And then try to do it for a minute and a half or two. So if you're trying to read for class, then do it for 5 or 10 minutes. If that's all you can do it, take a quick break and get back into it. Eventually you better do it for 30 minutes. Maybe 30 minutes is your capacity for now. Okay, well, I'm going to read for 30 minutes, take a break, go for a walk, watch some TV, check your Facebook, come back. But when you're doing it, doing one thing at a time. That's it. If you can practice that, it's a very difficult thing to do in our current environment because we're basically encouraged to do everything at one time. You're going to be much better at your job, at your sport, at your relationships, and at driving, hopefully. And you won't end up killing yourself or anyone else. So one thing at a time, small chunks. Over time, folks will get better. And if you're going to be a coach or you want to change your practice environment, those are the moments when you have the biggest opportunity to help athletes learn how to focus. So stop telling yourself or your athletes how, just focus. Explain to them how to do it. Tell them what to focus on. And really help them build up their concentration in pieces over time. Okay? Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you have enjoyed the podcast. Take care.